Well, local history is something that's something of a neglected subject, I believe. School children study national history, very few study local history. And I find that many adults have a very slim grasp of local history, and it's quite important to know where your community has come from and how it came to be what it is today. Good morning. I'm very glad to have you here at Skowhegan History House. I'm going to give you a tour through the house and tell you a little bit about the origin of History House and how it relates to the community. History House was the building itself. The house was built in 1839, and it was sort of a typical middle-class cottage at that era. And the first family that lived here was a blacksmith and his wife that moved in as newlyweds in 1840, and they had 10 children while they lived in this house. So the building got off to a pretty fast start. That family lived here for 23 years, and as they say, they had 10 children. The next family was two maiden ladies who lived here alone for the balance of the 1800s. And those two families were the only two families that actually lived in this house. The last of those two ladies was named Abby Tilton. She died in 1908, and after she died, the house was vacant for a number of years. The house was in rather poor condition, and in 1935 it was purchased by a lady named Louise Helen Coburn, who bought the house and restored it to its appearance as you see it today. And she restored it to be exactly as close as possible to the original 1840s characteristics of the house. The Coburn family were wealthy people, and they were benefactors to this community in many ways. She was one of that group. Governor Coburn was her uncle, Abner Coburn. He was the governor of the state of Maine in 1862 and 1863. He was of the firm A&P Coburn with his brother Philander. They were land and lumber and all of the things that made people wealthy in the 19th century. And he was involved in many social affairs and virtually every business in Skowhegan, one way or another. So. And he did many things for the community. He left money for the free public library. He built the courthouse. He provided land for Coburn Park and many other things of community. Louise Helen Coburn wrote Skowhegan on the Kennebec, which was a 2-volume history of Skowhegan published in 1941, and is still, as far as I'm concerned, the most definitive history that's been done to this point. And she stored her research material, papers that she had gathered in writing that book, in a museum out back that we'll see a little later. Her theme here was that she wanted a house that was a slice of life out of the middle 1800s. All of the objects that you see in this house are from that period of time. And the other theme is that everything here was used locally in this community, not necessarily in this house, but in this community. Coming to History House gives you a little slice of life out of the middle 1800s as it was in this specific community. And it's the only place in Skowhegan that you can get an experience of this type. After the house was restored, she began to take in items of everyday interest that had been used in the community. Among the first things she took in was this desk that belonged to her uncle, Abner Coburn, who had been the governor of the state of Maine in 1862, 1863. As you can see, it's a beautiful pine desk with ball and claw feet and in very, very good condition. A wonderful artifact from the 1860s. The gown on this mannequin behind me was worn by her mother, who was his sister-in-law to his inaugural ball in 1862, this very gown. As you can see, it's beautifully preserved and a very typical formal gown of that era. These four paintings are paintings of the first family that actually owned this property and lived in this area. The gentleman's name is John Neal, and he was a Revolutionary War hero, a colonel, I believe, in the Revolutionary War. And when the Kennebec proprietors were surveying this land and settling the area, they gave prominent lots of land to prominent citizens that they felt would become the nucleus of the new communities. And Colonel Neal was one of those recipients. They gave him about a 500-acre plot of land right here where we're standing. This was his mother, this was his wife, and this was his daughter. In 1800, Colonel Neal sold a piece of land here where History House is built today, and this later became the site of the Philbrick pottery and then eventually what is our History House today. Okay, well, moving around the room a little bit, we have this beautiful secretary, this piece of furniture. And once again, this is from either the 1840s or the 1850s. The original china that you see inside the secretary came over with the family of this gentleman in the picture, whose name was John Reddington McClellan. His family moved to the Boston area of Massachusetts in 1733 from Scotland, and they brought this china with them. So the china is very close to 300 years old. The secretary itself is part of the estate that this gentleman left when he died, and it now belongs to the Reddington Hospital, but it's on permanent loan here at History House. Many of the large pieces of fine furniture that you see in this room and around the house are from that McClellan collection. On top of the piece, you can see a silver coffee pot and a silver water pitcher from the early 1800s, perhaps from the 1830s. Okay, the uniform was not really a military uniform as it may appear. It was actually a uniform of the Coburn Guard, which was a veterans organization after the Civil War. The uniform dates from the 1870s, 1880s, and the Coburn Guard was named that because Governor Coburn provided the money for the maintenance and upkeep of the Guard, and it was a very popular cultural institution in this town for 20 or 30 years after the Civil War. The Coburn Guard was essentially a ceremonial unit that had a band and a marching unit, and there were hundreds of local veterans from Skowhegan. There were nearly 400 men from Skowhegan that served in the Civil War, so it was an area of great interest for many years after the war. Okay, we've now moved from the living room into the small room adjacent to it, which we believe was originally a birthing room in this old house. In the 1840s, it was fairly common practice to have a small room in the house, which was connected to the kitchen and easily accessible room for ladies to give birth. Most births were done in the home in those days. But in between birthing events, it was probably used as a small office for the old house. One of the interesting items in here is this desk, which was made by the Reverend Nathaniel Whitaker, who was the first minister in what was then Canaan before it became Skowhegan. Nathaniel Whitaker moved to Canaan in 1780, and he was only here for a 10-year period, and he was a cabinet maker as well as a preacher, and he made this desk for his own use. He also custom-made desks for other people. It was what he did to actually make a living, I guess. What we're looking at here is a Civil War surgeon's kit from the 1860s, and the kit belonged to a Dr. Wilbur, who had set up practice here in 1860 as a young physician, and he immediately joined the Union Army when the Civil War broke out, and eventually became the chief surgeon for the state of Maine. This is the kit that he carried with him on the battlefields of Virginia, and I don't even really want to know what he did with all these articles. This is a bone saw. Well, I hope it's a crosscut. I don't want to think of the alternative. These are class photographs, senior class curling parties. The curling parties was an event, an annual event, something like a senior prom, I guess. It was a costume party, and it was named that because the girls were allowed to curl the boys' hair. Which is, you can see some fancy hairdos on some of these guys. It was an event that apparently went on for a period of about 40 years, and I'm not quite sure why it started or why it ended, but it looks like a very fun time for all of the seniors. Okay, well, we've moved from the birthing room into the kitchen of the old house. All of the cooking in the 1840s was done over the open fireplace. Stoves weren't in general usage yet in central Maine until probably the 1850s or 60s. And when they had 10 children in this house and did all of the cooking over this open fire, it must have been a pretty intense activity to keep everyone fed. As you can see, some of the things that were used in the cooking process, the kettles and the crane to support the pots, the reflector oven, various cast iron utensils that were used to do their cooking. And this house was fortunate in the fact that it had a separate oven which was used to bake. And most people that had an oven of this type only baked once a week or something like that in order to utilize the heat from the oven efficiently. And they tried to bake enough ahead so that they could store it for the coming week. And they would store it in something like this little airtight box that says cake on it. Or any type of baked goods could be stored in these. What lent itself to being cooked on the fireplace were items that could be boiled, probably as much as anything, because they could be cooked in a one-pot fashion, and I presume that there were a lot of one-pot meals. Also in the fireplace, you can see this reflector oven down here. Now that was an oven that could be used to bake biscuits or other quick items that could be baked by simply putting that down on the hearth in front of a very hot bed of coals. And what many families did was to make biscuits or something of that type for breakfast every day, and then utilize the biscuits through the day. And this was to augment the baked goods that were done in the oven, perhaps on a weekly basis. You can see some of the other items that were used in the household, which were involved with the heat from the fireplace, but not directly with the cooking. And one of those items is this bed warmer, which was used to heat a bed in the middle of the winter. And you would fill that full of hot coals and ashes and actually take it upstairs to the bedroom, and with a long handle run it down between the sheets of the bed to warm up the bed before you climbed in. Also, along the same line are these little boxes, which are actually foot warmers. And once again, if you were going out for a journey in a sleigh or a buggy in hot weather, you would fill that full of hot coals and put it under your feet and perhaps wrap the family up in a buffalo robe and stay comfortable during the cold weather. I might say that before there was a house on this lot, on this property, there was a pottery factory on the riverbank out back. That was about 1799 when the pottery factory was established. And for about 25 years, it was a very vital business here in this community. And one of the items they made were these milk dishes, or milk settling pans, as they were sometimes called. These were a rather ingenious low-tech device to separate cream from milk. And essentially, you can see that the inside of the container is glazed and the outside is not. It's rough terracotta pottery. The milk would be placed warm, fresh from the cow, inside the dish. The dish then would be set in a shallow vessel of water, perhaps a slate sink with a little water in it. The water would soak up the exterior of the unglazed pottery, and as it evaporated, it would cool the milk on the interior, which eventually would allow the cream to separate, and then the cream would be skimmed off and stored until there was an adequate amount to churn into butter, perhaps. Those are called chargers, and they are pewter, and they were used as plates or as dishes that you could set other plates into, and they were very sturdy items of tableware. You can also see some of these smaller chargers which were used for babies, children's food, and there are a number of small children's vessels that were used to feed children from. Most of them involve pewter, which includes lead, which is probably very likely poisonous, but we didn't know that. They didn't know that at that time. These are candle molds, and after paraffin came into general use in the early 1800s, these were used to mold, people could mold their own candles. And there were a number of other lighting devices that were used here. And if you can pan along here, we can see these are whale oil burning lamps, these three here. Whale oil came into general use in the early 1800s, perhaps the 1820s or 30s, as a fuel that was, as a lighting device that was far superior to candles. And it was very popular for a period of 30 or 40 or 50 years until they virtually exterminated the whales, and then the sources of whale oil dried up. And then that's when kerosene lamps became more prevalent. This was a canteen, a military canteen, which was dropped by one of Benedict Arnold's soldiers in 1775. Benedict Arnold's army marched up the Kennebec Valley that year in an attempt to invade Quebec City, to capture Quebec City from the British, one of the first military events of the American Revolution. The canteen itself was dropped on Skowhegan Island, just below our present location, and was picked up by a family that settled the area in 1780, and that resided in that family for many years and finally came to History House. What we have here is one of the town's first telephones, perhaps even the very first telephone. This was used in 1890 by a fellow named Charles Folsom Jones. What's interesting about this phone is that it not only was used here in Skowhegan, but it was manufactured here. And as you can see from the placard, it was made by a company called the Northern Maine Shaver Molecular Telephone and Telegraph Company. It's rather unique in the sense that it has two earpieces rather than one. And the theory, I guess, was to hold these up to your ears and shout into this brass cone. And presumably if you hollered loud enough, they could hear you next door. The phone was unique in the sense that it used no electricity. It worked on something of the same principle as two cans with a string stretched between them. The wire had to be kept under tension in order for the voice to carry over the wires. And I have no idea how efficient the phone was, but it certainly was a well-built machine and certainly popular as it went along. Okay, this is a rather typical spinning wheel from the middle 1800s. This large wheel was used to spin sheep's wool into yarn, and many families made their own yarn, and most ladies did their own knitting for at least part of the family's garments. We have a photograph that was taken, we're not certain when, but probably about 1900, of a lady actually using this very spinning wheel, or one identical to it. And we can find out something of the methods that she used by looking carefully at that photograph. It was very important for people to do many of their own manufacturing of clothing and many other things. It was simply not possible for the early settlers to go to the store and buy pre-made garments. They just didn't exist in those days. Okay, moving around the wall of the kitchen, we come to, I'd like to point out this photograph of the Heselton House Hotel. The Heselton House was located on the same location as the present Skowhegan Municipal Building. And the event that was occurring here in this photograph was the introduction of a new steam pumper for the fire department. You can see the steam pumper on the left-hand side of the image. This was in 1882, and it was sort of a fireman's muster event. The Heselton House burned in 1904, and the lot that it sat on was bought by the town of Skowhegan, and in 1907 they built the present-day municipal building. Just below it here, we have this desk, which was made by the Reverend Whitaker, the same fellow that made the desk in the birthing room. And this was the first postmaster's desk from Skowhegan. Actually, the first post office was called Skowhegan Falls, and it was introduced, it was formed about 1802. The postmaster was in a building called the Lock Tavern on the north side, on the south side of the river. This letter was found, I found it when I was cleaning out this desk several years ago, crumpled in behind one of the drawers in here, and it's dated 1817. Apparently it was lost somehow, and was lost for all those years. It's a very interesting little letter, a chatty little letter by a gentleman who was on a journey and written back to a friend. This is a cookbook from the Lock Tavern, dated 1807. And this has some very interesting recipes in it, things like pickled eels, hogshead cheese, delicacies of the day. Moving around the kitchen, this secretary or desk belonged to an attorney who first practiced in Athens. His name was Charles Green. Later he became a judge for the local court and lived out his life here in Skowhegan. You can see this was his writing surface. I'm certain this was where he stored his law books and whatever he needed to conduct his practice. I think the significance is that it's a unique piece of furniture. It was custom made for him, and it's made from native pine, and incidentally it was made about 1810. So it really is just a rather unique piece of pine furniture, I think. The rocking chair was used by the Swan family, who was a very early, among the very early settlers in this area. And I've recently found out that this rocking chair dates to about 1750 or perhaps even 1740. It was definitely not originally used in this community because it's older than that. It probably was used in southern Massachusetts in a farm home at that time. Okay, we're standing in the museum wing of Skowhegan History House. Now, this room, was added in 1936 when she had the house refurbished. She added this room. Her primary purpose in adding this room was to store her research papers for her writing. These files over here are all of the research material that she gathered in writing this two-volume history. It took her about 10 years to research and write this book. And she gathered tens of thousands of documents, literally tens of thousands of documents in writing this book. And all of the transcriptions of those documents and some of the original documents themselves are in these file drawers. And much of the information, of course, was compiled from the newspapers. We have thousands of deeds, many early town records, a great resource, probably the best source of local Skowhegan history available anywhere. But there was considerably more room than she needed for that purpose, so she made this into a general purpose museum. And many of the items in here are artifacts and interesting items that belong to local people that don't necessarily fit into the main collection in the house itself. One of the more interesting articles is this 13-star flag.